And this painting actually was done in 1966 when I was at art school in Los Angeles, when pop art was really the beginning. That was right after I'd seen the Andy Warhol show. And so I came back and I decided to get posters and cutouts and Alfred E. Newman, Mad Magazine, Batman, and some of these were actually cutouts from magazine ads. Anyway, this was an 8-foot by 12-foot painting, and this is how I started. Then I came back to Louisiana, started painting Louisiana, and then the Blue Dog. But we're going to try to do this in about 40 minutes, 35, 40 minutes, depends on how fast I can paint this. What I'll usually do is after I finish this, I'll take it back to the studio and work on it for another 2 or 3 days. So you're going to see it. I have no idea what I'm going to do. I might just paint a dog or some kind of way. I was going to put a tiger with it. I ought to, but I'm still stuck with the LSU tiger in my head. Actually, we're having LSU Museum is having a show of mine in the fall, in the middle of the summer this year, and I have painted a lot of our governors, from Huey Long to Edwin Edwards, and this is the first time all the Louisiana governors are going to be hanging together in one room at the LSU Museum. It's going to last about 2 months. So I'm going to start painting the Blue Dog, and my wife, who loves to talk, will fill you in. Thank you.
Wait, you got to give me that mic. That was my feedback. Okay, so happy to be here in Auburn. Thank you all so much for coming out. I'm going to move around a little bit so that hopefully everyone can see. But if I'm standing in one place too long and you can't see, this is very casual, so just tell me to move over. And if you have questions as we go along, there will be a time for probably a few questions with me at the end, but definitely some questions with George at the end too. But as we go along, you're welcome to raise your hand also, or holler it out, or whatever you want. This is actually my very first visit ever to Auburn. George has come here a number of times over the years, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit further into the slideshow. As a matter of fact, where's my the clicker? Thank you. Thank you so much. And so I hurriedly went on Facebook this week and I said, okay, who knows anything about Auburn? Because we're going to speak there and I want to, understand a little bit about your community. And immediately, and I had forgotten this, shame on me, my sister's mother-in-law gets right on there and she says, well, Wendy, I went to Auburn. And I said, oh my gosh, I totally forgot that. And I said, tell me a little bit about it. She says, well, in 1965, I was the office receptionist for Governor George Wallace. And she said, almost as an afterthought, but she was waiting for my reaction, I was the homecoming queen at Auburn University. And she also said, and I truly don't know what this means, that I'm supposed to tell you War Eagle. Is that good? Her name was Adrienne Wise, 1965. She was a Chi Omega. Maybe somebody here? Okay, that's the rundown of my Auburn history. So we're going to start with George's extensive history, starting all the way back in New Iberia, Louisiana. As he told you, that's where he was born and raised. Okay, we definitely have Cajuns over here. That's great. That's wonderful. So George was born in New Iberia in the 1940s, and you have to remember, growing up in New Iberia, it was a really small little Cajun town. There were no art museums, no art galleries, no art teachers in the schools, no art books in the library. There were no paintings on the wall. Nobody painted. So it was not something that George grew up around. In fact, the way he got exposed to art was in the 3rd grade, he actually was very ill with polio and was bedridden for 6 months. And there was a very interesting invention that came out that year in the 1950s in the United States, the paint by number. And so, obviously, polio was highly contagious. They did not have a television yet. His friends couldn't come over to play. There was no computer games. So what is his mother going to do? George was an only child. His father was a bricklayer and was gone all the time to keep her son occupied. She brought him paint by numbers, and she brought him modeling clay. And so George lied in bed, sick, unable to walk, and started on these paint by numbers. And he hated them. He loved painting. But he hated the flowers, the Last Supper. We all remember the paint by numbers, right? The little cottages and all these things, the boat on the river. He wanted to paint things that he knew and loved in New Iberia. What would that be? That would be for George, well, alligators and nutria. That would also be fire trucks and cowboys and Indians and military men and all sorts of things like that. So that's what he started drawing and painting. So from the very beginning, from the 3rd grade, from being sick, he started painting things that he knows and loves. So from there, he tells his parents, guess what, I'm going to be an artist. Well, he's 8 years old. That's like saying, guess what, I'm going to be the president, right? And we all encourage our children when they say things like that, and that's exactly what his parents did. And they said, okay, that's great, even though they'd never even met an artist. They didn't have any clue, really, what that meant and what that entailed. But George was serious, and he went on through school painting and drawing. There's a famous story about Coach Blanco. That was our former governor, Kathleen Blanco. Some of you Louisiana folks know the Blancos. Coach Blanco threw George out of class for drawing when he was... That's right, out of St. Peter's College, which became Catholic High. You really are from there. That's great. You let me know if I mess up, but quietly. So he threw him out of class for drawing. He always said that he knew he'd made a big... that George has never let him forget that, Coach didn't support him as an artist. But George went on and he said, I'm going to be an artist. He drew monster pictures by the time he was 16, and that's how he made all of his gas money. He would actually paint on T-shirts and sell them for $10 each and made enough money for gas. So from the very beginning, he was very serious about this pursuit. He went to college at USL. It's now called the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. He studied art there, but he was somewhat disappointed because after 6 semesters there, he felt like he'd learned everything he could learn. He wanted to study art from real artists, from practicing artists, not necessarily professors, but people who maybe guest lectured for once or twice a month, things like that. He wanted to go to a real art school. But how do you find out about these things? There was no internet. There was no... How do you find this? Again, he didn't know anyone who was artists. And so he had a friend who had applied to art school and gave him some brochures. And one of the brochures was from a school called the Art Center College of Design. And George did not know at the time that it was the top art school in the United States. He sent off his portfolio of his work from USL, and he was accepted. And it was in Los Angeles in the mid-1960s, and George had never been out of Southwest Louisiana. He got on a train and went to L.A. by himself. And it wasn't until he got there that he learned that this was a graduate school. George was the only person up to that time, I don't know the history since then, but up to that time that they ever accepted who did not have a degree. Quite something, all based on his portfolio alone. So he got to the Art Center College of Design, and that's where he did this piece here, as you can see, in 1966. So what was he studying when he got to Art Center? Well, the academic art of the day was abstract expressionism, which I know you are all very familiar with. And he was tired of this because this is what he'd been learning at UL. So he says, I really want to learn the fundamentals. I want to learn figure drawing. I want to learn design. I want to learn lines and hard edges. I want to understand color. And so it was fabulous for him because, indeed, these guest lecturers, these artists, Loisa Feidelson was one of the most famous that came and taught him, who was the king of hard-edge painting in the 1960s and 70s, and they came and taught him at Art Center. He learned all the fundamentals. He, in fact, struggled in his figure drawing class, and over the holidays, one Christmas, checked a Michelangelo book of drawings out of the library and spent 2 solid weeks doing nothing but copying those drawings until he could get back to class the next semester, and the model came in and sat down, and he took one look at her pose and then drew her a la Michelangelo and got an A. So George has always had this knack for figuring out how he's going to do what he wants to do, how he's going to be what he wants to be. Now, the big thing that happened while George was in LA was not only his art studies, but what was happening in the art world. In 1966, the year that he did this piece, Andy Warhol splashed onto the art scene with his Campbell's soup cans. And he did it in LA. And the first time George saw it was on the front page of the New York Times. He and his friends all ran to the Ferris Gallery to see the show. They'd never seen anything like this. This idea, you can imagine, after seeing all this abstract and all these color fields, of taking an object from the popular culture and reinserting it back into the popular culture as a piece of art. The idea of repetitive imagery, the idea of hard edges, the idea of taking something so familiar and really treating it as something abstract was very intriguing to him. And so that's where this came from, and that was his huge project. And as he told you, this is really large. It's about 8 feet across. It is still in our house. It's actually a collage. This was his pop project. And he did this all on his own, not in a class, because the professors rejected pop art. As so often happens, it takes a while for everybody to catch up. But he was intrigued. So then what happens? He's going to drive to Louisiana, back home, after art school, and he crosses Texas. Now, what do we have in Texas? Huge, big skies. And you cross the Sabine River into Louisiana, and suddenly the sky is not so big. The sky is small. And that's because it's underneath the oak trees. So George is very visual, and he noticed this. He looked at this. He took pictures of Louisiana, and he noticed in every photograph, the one thing that was always there was the tree, and that the light was underneath those trees. If you stand under the tree, you can't see the sky over your head. You're seeing it in the distance. So he's thinking to himself all about Campbell soup cans and Brillo boxes and dollar bills, and he's also thinking about fields of color and hard edges and all these things we just talked about. And he says, well, what's my Campbell soup can? And he thinks about Louisiana. Well, he's going to make it the oak tree. And what really solidified it was when he went to the New Orleans museums, the New Orleans Museum of Art and also the Cabildo, to look at old Louisiana paintings. And guess what he saw? Everybody who ever painted Louisiana painted it in a European style with a large high sky. It's great, by the way, talking to an artsy audience. You can talk about these things. With a large big sky and then obviously the landscape down below and very small. And he said, but that's not Louisiana. So what did he do? And I'm going to jump up here for a few minutes. He took the oak tree, he brought it to the front of his canvas, and he cut it off at the top. Nobody had ever done that before George. It's such a simple thing when you think about it. Nobody ever did that before him. And when that happens, you end up with the light underneath your tree. And in the very beginning, all of his paintings, this is from 1968. He just got back from art school. In the beginning, all of his paintings have little other elements, houses, buggies. He's still playing. It's interesting for me, just knowing his work so well, to look at things like this ground. He still didn't understand how to deal with especially large areas of grass, large areas of foreground, so he's just kind of, knocking those out to try and get this area. This is what's critical. And then he looks at this and he says, well, what's the most important thing about this? He gets rid of the buggy, he gets rid of the house, and he saves one little section. And that's all that matters. And you know why? Because it's made up of 3 elements: tree, ground, and sky. That's it. George painted hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of these over the next 3 to 4 years, one after the other, of tree, ground, and sky, because it was infinite, the possibilities of all those things that he discovered in LA: design, color, hard edges. And the big plus, of course, was the symbolism of Louisiana and the wonderful landscape and the wonderful place that he loved. One of the things that George realized, this is young George, having just come back from art school. Sorry for the quality of the photograph, but I think some of these old photos are really fun to show. He painted all different sizes. I hope you can see these are the oak trees here and how infinite the possibilities are. He would paint, this is what they call a coulee in Louisiana. I guess they call it a coulee in Alabama too, I don't know. But he would paint them sometimes to look like roads, sometimes to look like rivers, and oftentimes it doesn't really matter, because the idea is that it's a form of transportation into the distance. And also the Cajuns, of course, came to Louisiana from Canada on boats, also up the Bayou Teche. So for them, the river was the road. So he kind of made it work both ways. Now what's interesting is George had a show at the, his very first show was at the Louisiana State Museum. Help me.
Pink Palace.
At the Pink Palace, right, which is in Lafayette at the University Museum, and the reporter comes to review the show, and he's all excited. It's going to be his very first newspaper review, and he opens up the paper, and guess what the headlines say? Artist paints dreary, monotonous oaks. And I've read the article. That was the best part of it, which is true. And so he was devastated, completely devastated. She didn't understand all those things I just told you. She didn't see it at all. But the thing is, George saw it. It never occurred to him that he had to explain those things. And he still doesn't explain those things. I explain those things. But in the end, it doesn't really matter, because what matters is what you see in the work. You probably see trees in this work. He does not. He sees shapes and designs, which is why he can paint it again and again. This should start to sound familiar. What's interesting is, after the article especially, people came to his little gallery there and they said, this guy can't paint. You can't paint. All you paint is trees. That's the only thing you paint. And he got really upset. And so he painted this self-portrait. This is painting. Everybody thinks this is a photograph. He painted this self-portrait, and he never offered it for sale. He stuck it in the corner of his studio. It's just a little bit smaller than this, how it looks on this screen. And he hated it. It was like a reminder to him of having to prove himself. And every time skeptics would walk in the gallery, he would say, no. And then they would say, oh, he really can paint. And I was so shocked when the New Orleans Museum of Art had a huge retrospective on George in 2008, and they had almost 300 pieces, and this painting was hanging in the front room with all the landscapes, a lot of them that were from that early show. And I heard people say that. Oh my God, that's a painting. Look, he really can paint. I thought, oh my gosh. After all these years and all these paintings, this is still plaguing him. So it's kind of funny. He still keeps it around and throws it out every now and again. This is 20 years later. So he still paints the oak trees. A lot of people think that George started the Blue Dog and he stopped painting everything else. Absolutely not true. There's a large crossover period with the Cajun paintings, and the oak trees have remained throughout. This is about 1985 or so. Again, even though it's much brighter, look at the difference in the treatment of the ground. I know it's hard to see on the slides, but he's getting more confident, more sophisticated in the way he works these things. But again, the same elements of the light and the distance. And it cut off at the top. This is the year after Katrina. He did a whole series called Blue Bayou, just really embracing his culture and embracing the land that he loves so much. And of course, you can see the influence of color here. This is this year. It's kind of interesting. George, all the early works were painted in oil. A lot of people notice right away, especially if you're into art or you're an artist, that most of the Blue Dog paintings are very bright and bold and are probably acrylic paint. They are. There's a reason for that. One of them is, of course, that the image lends itself to it, but it didn't in the beginning. That's not how it started off. Again, it was an illness that guided George. He contracted chemical hepatitis in the late 1980s and nearly died, and that was from those paint fumes, all the warning signs on the cans, any of you who paint and varnish your own works. As he sprayed the canvases, he was spraying his own lungs, and he was told he can never paint again. Well, that's, for someone like him, saying you can never, all kinds of things. You can never sleep again. You can never, be with your children again. It was a huge, huge problem. And so he learned to paint in acrylic paint, but it was very frustrating for him to make that adjustment. Now he's very happy with acrylic. He's happy both ways. And I say both ways because this painting is done with a new kind of paint. It's a water-based oil. I know it sounds very strange, but it's new on the market. It's not quite as thick and doesn't take quite as long to dry as the traditional oils, but it's enough to where he can work again in this fashion. And so he enjoys picking that up every now and again and kind of revisiting the old style. But again, I hope you can tell this is very much his mature style and very different from what we looked at in the beginning. This was George's first painting with people. Isn't that amazing? I mean, his first one. It took him 6 months. It's called the Aioli Dinner. It's a gourmet dinner club. They met every month from 1890 to 1920 on the lawn of a different plantation home in and around New Iberia, Louisiana. The women standing in the back row did the cooking, and the young men around the table served, and the men ate. This is George's grandfather right here, Jean Courget, and this is his uncle kind of peeking his head out, Emile Courget. And the setting is the Darby House Plantation, those of you from New Iberia, which unfortunately has since burned down. But when George did the painting, it was still standing, and he went over there and did a lot of photography to kind of set up what he wanted to do. Now, the reason he did that is because even though he used photographs to help put this painting together, he used a number of photographs and he placed it like he wanted. Obviously, none of the women are standing in the back here, not near as many boys around the table, and there's no, the plantation house in the background is completely different. So he combined a lot of paintings together. Also, not all the men that are in the Aioli dinner, even though they were all in the dinner club, not all of them were friends, and a lot of them never would have sat at the same dinner table. So I just like to think of this sort of as a dinner of ghosts, you know, getting together in the afterlife. And I put this to remind me to tell you about George's connection to Auburn. He used to come through here all the time because he had a great relationship with Oxmoor House Publishing House, and he always passed through. They published his very first book, The Cajuns of George Rodrigue, in 1976. The book became a legend. It was chosen by Rosalind Carter as the official gift of state during the Carter administration, and it was the very first book published nationally on the Cajun culture. And George wrote it in both French and English. It's pretty fabulous.
And I wrote it in French, and I don't speak French.
We're going to get to the Blue Dog shortly, I promise. So here, but we got Blue Dog over here, we got Cajuns going over here. So, what does this mean, these Cajuns? Well, George is wondering how he's going to paint these people with his trees. Notice the trees are still the same, cut off at the top and the light underneath. Well, he wondered, he tells me this is how his process went. What would a person look like who was standing behind one of my trees and walked out in front? Well, he thought, he's outside, he exists outside, I'm painting him outside, so he's going to be kind of primitive, like the land. Maybe not as primitive as, say, Clementine Hunter, but primitive, like the land, looking. And also he's going to be kind of timeless. You know, is this 1750? Is this 1850? When is this? And he really got great with his symbolism by saying, not only is he going to come out from that tree, but he's going to be pasted on it. I'm going to cut out my figures, and I'm going to paste them onto Louisiana. Just like the Cajuns were cut out of Acadiana, of Canada, and paste onto South Louisiana. He's going to do the same thing in his paintings. So look at this. You see how the bushes frame these heads and nobody touches the sky? They're locked in. They can't move. So George's paintings are all like that, all the way up to today. Nothing can move. If it moves, then the structure of the entire work is gone. That goes back to the design of the very first piece that was on this screen. He's always thinking that way. Oh, the other thing that I think is really important about these Cajun figures, this is his mother's school class, by the way. His mother was born in 1905 in New Iberia. Let's see. This is her right here, the third one over. And by the way, she died at age 103 a couple years ago, and she was still waiting for George to get a real job. She used to tell me, like, with the phone company or something. It was really kind of funny. What are you going to do? How is he going to retire? She always, it's kind of funny. Anyway, so you notice all these people are in white. All of George's Cajun figures are in white. And they're under these trees. They shouldn't be in white. They should be in shadow. This is completely breaking the rules of art. They're in white because of that symbolism. They are glowing with their culture. Their spirit is shining out. Isn't that beautiful? He came up with all this as a young man. It's a wonderful sentiment. So, again, the tree cut off at the top, the light in the distance, the figures, nobody's touching the sky. They're completely shaped in. George would actually design his figures on the canvas, and then he would design all of this around them so that they couldn't move. This is one of his most famous Cajun characters. This is Jule Blonde. A very famous Cajun legend. Supposedly there was a convict in Port Arthur, Texas, who was Cajun in the 1920s, and he wrote a beautiful waltz about his love, who he missed, Jule Blonde, and it became the Cajun anthem. Now, before George, nobody knew what Jule Blonde looked like. He came up with her, and he's very well associated with her. What I love, I only brought one example for you here today, but he's painted her hundreds and hundreds of times. He's used dozens of models. We could have a huge museum show of nothing but Jule Blondes. But the interesting thing is he painted this one in the middle of the night at 3 in the morning in an hour because he couldn't sleep. He made her up, and this is his most famous one. Isn't that neat? This is kind of like his Mona Lisa. And this is his other Mona Lisa. This would be Evangeline, of course, Longfellow's story of the saga of the Acadians. And this is Evangeline waiting for Gabriel on the bench. Again, all the elements that I told you about. She's really glowing with her culture, and she doesn't even have feet. She's like a ghost sitting there waiting for her love. Isn't that pretty? What I like is our friend, Diane Bernard Keogh, modeled for this, and she's our bookkeeper today for the galleries. And George photographed her a ton of times in the 1970s, and he actually still paints occasionally from those photographs. The thing, if you were to ask George what made him famous in Louisiana, he would say, without a doubt, festival posters. They were all over Louisiana. He's done a poster for every single festival throughout the state. So I just brought you one example, but there are hundreds, just like there's hundreds of Evangelines. And I brought this because it always cracks me up. This is painted just like a person, out in front, right, framed by the tree, and George calls it the 300-pound chicken on a bike. And I brought it because I always think it's a nice segue into Huey Long. Doesn't it look exactly the same, the chicken and the governor? It does. So if you ask George, he'll tell you this is his first real portrait. For years, he would never say that he was a portrait artist. And one of the most beautiful things that, well, there were many beautiful things that came out of the show at the New Orleans Museum was John Bullard insisted on a portrait wall for George. Actually, a whole portrait room for George. It ended up being the largest room of the entire show. And George said, but I'm not a portrait artist. And then after we walked in, when they hung it, he said, maybe I am a portrait artist. He never thought about it that way, but this was the one he always called a portrait. This is Huey standing in front of the Evangeline Oak saying, just as Evangeline cried for her Gabriel, Louisiana is crying for roads and schools and bridges. And it's the speech that won the election. And this is kind of a ghosty Capitol in the background because he hasn't built it yet. And what's interesting is George has painted, well, let's see, I think I put, Earl. George describes this as Crazy Earl screaming into the microphone. And this is him on the campaign trail, too. These are little pea patches in the back here because he used to go in his white Cadillac from farm to farm all throughout North Louisiana and buy the peas from one farmer and then give them to the next, family in the next town. So it was that was his way he got around. Anyway, since this time, George has painted all of our Louisiana governors, for the governors. And what's really cool about this show at the Louisiana State Museum, or the LSU Museum of Art this summer, is that it's the first time all the paintings will be together. So they'll all be hanging. I did not bring them all for you here today. You're going to have to come see the show. This is quite a famous one, as he was getting a reputation for as a portrait artist. The Republican Party approached him, and they commissioned him to paint Ronald Reagan when he was president. This was in 1988. And George went to the ranch. There's a funny story on this. He goes to the Reagan's ranch to photograph him, and here came Reagan on his horse, right? And the horse had this real droopy head and was kind of barely going along, and George said it didn't look like a president at all. And he knew he wanted to call it an American hero, but he couldn't put him on a droopy horse. So he was so frustrated. He gets back to his studio in Lafayette at the time, and he's going through all of his photographs that he took, and he said, I can't use any of these. It looks like the president is on an old mule. I can't do this. So he goes through his photo albums, and he finds a great picture of Gene Autry on his horse, and he stuck Reagan's head on it. The president loved it, by the way. So the painting did hang in the White House, and after that it hung in the Reagan Library, and Nancy Reagan ultimately donated it to the Lod Cook Alumni Center at LSU, which is where it hangs today. The Democratic National Party commissioned him to paint, obviously, Bill Clinton and Al Gore. This was for the second inauguration. This was the official poster for the Clinton-Gore inauguration. And Clinton specifically requested, I want to be painted with the blue dog walking into the 21st century. There you have it. Pretty great. Because you're having a New Orleans celebration today, I tried to pick some things specifically New Orleans, like George's good friend, Chef Paul Prudhomme here. Pretty fabulous. I hope you get to K. Paul's when you're in New Orleans. This painting actually hangs there. And so do a number of other paintings. I brought one more for you here. But one thing I want to point out here, George did this to celebrate the opening of Chef Paul's restaurant in New York City, which is now closed, but he opened this in the late 1980s. That's why there's a big apple here. And you can't see it in the slide. Unfortunately, you can't see what I'm about to point out to you in the painting hardly anymore either, but there's a big redfish, literally blackened, into this tree here. But the painting hung in Chef's kitchen for so long in the restaurant that it blackened. So... But again, he's glowing underneath the tree. It's wonderful Cajun from Opelousas. And I thought it'd be so fun because the photographs are so great. This is a wonderful tradition Chef Paul started years ago in the late 1980s called the Great Cajun Omelet. And they started this in Abbeville. It was an exchange with a little town called Braziers, France. And they made this omelet with something like 10,000 eggs and all this kind of stuff. And George thought this was so cool that he recorded it in a painting. Isn't that great? And this does hang in the main dining room at K. Paul's, so go check it out. It's huge. Music, also really great. Hank was not from New Orleans, but he was on the Hadacol Caravan. I'm sure he passed through Alabama many times on that too. Hadacol, of course, was invented by Dudley LeBlanc, and Dudley LeBlanc was kind of a, you know, the old medicine salesman kind of people that came through on his wagon, sort of, but he was in a big white car with an entourage, and he invented Hadacol, which was basically all alcohol and elixir, and he said he called it Hadacol because he had to call it something. So we had all these musicians and entertainers traveling on the Hadacol Caravan. And what I wanted to point out about this is that George was not commissioned to paint this. This is what he painted for him. So I think that's really key, because usually when you see an artist painting portraits like this, it's a commission from somebody. It's going somewhere specific. George painted this for George because he really wanted to record his favorite musician. This painting is about 8.5 feet tall. And even greater, I remember when this painting sold. It was in 1991 in the New Orleans Gallery to a man from Birmingham. Of course. And so I put this one in here just because this is on the show right now that's traveling around the state of Louisiana. If you get the chance, it's just one of my favorites, and everybody's drawn to it in the show. This is called the Fado Doe. This is George's son Jacques right here, who's of course in his 30s now and grown and always embarrassed, but really great of him. And also, going all the way back to what we talked about in the beginning, this was done in 1989. Look how the people are framed. Look here. And this wonderful pattern of the sky, and then the branch, and then the sky, and the bushes, and the people. So all the way back to those very, very early pieces that he did 20 years before this. Now, what's interesting, I bet you thought we'd never get to it, is that this was painted 5 years before what I just showed you. This was also painted 4 years before Hank Williams and 4 years before President Reagan. So again, he didn't start painting the blue dog and stop painting everything else. There's a huge crossover period, probably about 10 years. This is the very first blue dog painting. It's called Watchdog. It's from a book of ghost stories called Bayou from 1984 that George illustrated for the World's Fair in New Orleans. It was full of Louisiana ghost stories. And one of those stories was called the Loup-Garou. The literal translation of loup-garou is werewolf, but it wasn't really a werewolf type thing. His mother used to say, George was actually very familiar with this legend. When he was a little boy, his mom would tell him, if you're not good today, the loup-garou's going to come get you tonight. So what I would tell kids, like when we went through the New Orleans Museum and we'd all stand in front of this painting, this seemed to be the only way everybody would get it. Imagine if I asked everybody out here to draw me the boogeyman. You would all draw something completely different. This is what it's hard for people to grasp about the blue dog. This is something George invented. There was nothing out there that showed what the loup-garou looked like. It was completely open to interpretation. And that's what George thought he was painting. And nothing said the loup-garou was blue. That was kind of a last-minute decision for George. He thought the dark night sky would cast this blue-gray shade on the dog. He gave it red eyes and put it in front of a haunted house. And you've already seen how many times he paints from photographs. Well, what was he going to do for the loup-garou? Well, he was going to model it after his pet. This was his studio dog, Tiffany, Little Mutt. And by the time he painted her, she had been dead already 4 years. She used to sit and keep him company all night in his studio. But you have to remember, as wonderful and endearing as it would be to think that George was trying to immortalize Tiffany in his painting, it was really the last thing from his mind. He really was trying to paint this scary loup-garou image, not a cute little studio dog pet. So it's kind of interesting that he chose his pet to model this shape on. The early paintings, this would be 1989, 1990, were all very ghostly, always in cemetery scenes, always in bayou scenes, with all the same elements we've talked about. The dog is painted like a person, like it's human size. It's not a dog at your feet. So we can have an exchange with this shape. And indeed, like the tree, George does not see a dog. George sees shape and design. And he sees a vehicle to eventually comment on today after 25 years of commenting on yesterday. If that makes any sense. And we'll see some more of that shortly. He started having a lot of fun with titles as soon as he realized what he could do here. This was called Have You Ever Loved Somebody Who Just Couldn't Love You? This was right place, wrong time. He really started having fun. He got going. And this painting, this would kill me. In the New Orleans Museum, again, I always think back on that show because we did so many tours through that. This is a huge painting. It's our painting. It hangs in our house. It's taller than me. And when you would get to it in the show, I would ask everybody the same question on the tour, and the only people who would ever get it right were the little kids. And I'm going to ask you, because it actually applies today too. What is different about this painting than every other painting we've looked at here today? That's right. We've got children in the audience. It's great. Everybody's a kid at heart and can see. That's fabulous. The adults could not see after looking at all those paintings, and I started wondering what happens to us as we get older, that we can't see, that we can't look. The little children, I can remember this one kid. This is just getting off track for a minute, but it was such a cute story. After going through the museum, she took me out in the sculpture garden, and she says, "Look, Miss Wendy, if I stand right here and look up, the light shines underneath the trees, just like in Mr. George's paintings." Like, great, the kids could see. They taught me a lot. So this is the first one without a tree. Well, what happens? Oh my gosh, he realizes he can explode. He can do "My baby made a clown out of me." He can do "I ain't no cartoon dog." Very important. This dog never moves. This dog has no backside. Otherwise, it's in danger of becoming like a cartoon. Like this, it is a shape. It is a piece of fine art. It is something only belonging to him. It is not something that moves around or has a speech bubble coming out of its mouth. It's not a character. It doesn't have that kind of feeling to it. This was one of the things that really put the blue dog on the map. This was commissioned by Absolute Vodka in 1992. It was full page in USA Today and was so successful that they commissioned another piece from him in 1993, and it hit every single magazine in the United States for about 3 years. It was huge. I remember those days because everything changed in the gallery, from everybody walking in saying, "What's with this blue dog?" to everybody walking in saying, "Oh my gosh, it's that blue dog." This changed everything. This was called Absolute Louisiana. This one was also one that really put George on the map. This was one of his most famous blue dog paintings. It's called Hawaiian Blues. He painted this for Neiman Marcus. They commissioned it for the cover of their catalog in 1999 when they were opening their store in Honolulu at the Ala Moana Center. Now, you have to imagine, this was for the cover of their catalog, so there would have been a spine. George had this in mind as he designed this, going down the middle of it. It was important to him that something happened as you turned the book over. So he amassed all these butterflies on the back of the book, again, cut out and pasted, this time onto an old Hawaiian postcard sort of look, and they fly across the spine of the book and form a lei around the dog's neck on the front. It's called Hawaiian Blues. Pretty great, I think. This one I just put because it's one of my favorites. It hangs in our house. It hung for years in a bandstand behind a restaurant in Lafayette. It's great. It's George's picture from when he was a little boy on a pony. Isn't that cute? I know. And he changed it to a big blue bull. It's pretty great. He also oftentimes incorporated flags, I should say, because George was very keen on how proud the Cajuns were to be Americans. This is called The Other Brother. And since we're on musicians, and because you have the fabulous, which, by the way, is the first time I've ever seen the entire New Orleans Jazz Fest collection together. Thank you for bringing that. That was so great. I thought we'd talk a little bit about those. In 1995, actually in 1994, the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival approached George and said, "We want you to do the poster." He said no. And they said, "Why not?" And he said, "Because I want to paint Louis Armstrong, and you only let the poster be people who have actually played at the fest." And he knew this because he had researched it before. And they said, "Yes, we have that strict rule." Louis Armstrong died 2 years before the Jazz Festival began. So they said, no, you don't understand. It's great publicity, all this. They hardly pay you anything, by the way. Everybody thinks the artist makes all kinds of money for these. You don't make even as much as he would on a couple prints for something like this. He made very, very little money. But it's all about, obviously, the honor to be asked to paint the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival poster. So he said, "I don't want to put the blue dog in a Jazz Fest poster. What does the blue dog have to do with a Jazz Fest poster? And I don't paint the blue dog like this. I paint the blue dog like this, as though the dog was Louis Armstrong. Again, like a person with this contact." And they said, okay. They finally came back to him, "We'll compromise. You can paint Louis Armstrong if you put the blue dog in it." This was the single most successful poster in the history of the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival. It sold out in the first weekend. That had never happened before. They absolutely flipped out, the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival, and immediately asked George to do the next year's festival. Not what you expected, is it? This is what George painted in 1995 for the 96 festival, Mahalia Jackson. The Jazz Fest picks the subject, and they told him this is who he wanted to paint. He had plenty of months' time, so he did this beautiful design, put it all together. Now, Jazz Fest goes to print with their posters on the 26th of December. On December 23rd, they called him, and they said there was a problem. Mahalia Jackson's estate wants $50,000 for the use of her image on the poster. And George says, what's the problem? Pay them the $50,000. And of course, he wasn't even making $50,000 on the painting, so he wasn't paying the $50,000. And they said, no way, which it's interesting, because eventually they did, and Mahalia Jackson ended up the subject of a wonderful Michaelopoulos poster that you also have in there. And here he was with this beautiful painting, and it's the 23rd of December. And they said, we have to do something else. They had other ideas of who they wanted subjects to be, but he had a little clout here. Now, they were over a barrel. And he said, either it's my good friend Pete Fountain or I don't do it. And guess what? Pete came over to the house the night of December 23rd. George photographed him. He sat for him. And George painted a straight 48 hours. I remember that. All the way through Christmas Eve, all the way through Christmas Day. And the very wet painting went to be photographed. After working months on Mahalia Jackson, 48 hours, and was photographed sopping wet and made the deadline for Jazz Fest. Now, a couple interesting things about this. The press slammed him on this. It was absolutely, he was vilified over this. You know why? Because they said he couldn't come up with an original idea. He couldn't change the way the poster looked. He used the same design as last time. Well, as I showed you, he didn't. But he didn't have time to come up with a new design. He had to use the old design, but those things never get out there. So nobody knew that. He had to use the same design. He really didn't have a choice. He didn't have the time to work it out. The other bad thing that happened with this, unfortunately, because working with Pete was a wonderful experience for him. He loved that. But local artists picketed the gallery. You know, the Jazz Fest poster is really seen by a lot of people as a way to get your name out there and for exposure in the arts. And here was George snapping it up twice. And not to mention, it was just so runaway. Was he going to be painting them every year, for example? He didn't expect this. I think the negativity in the press he was prepared for. Ever since that first Oak Tree article, he doesn't pay any attention to the press. But this thing about the artist picketing really, really got to him. And so he told Jazz Fest, I will never do another Jazz Fest poster. It's interesting to me because here it is all these years later. This is at the New Orleans Museum of Art in 2008. This painting of Pete Fountain is owned by the New Orleans Museum of Art. It's on the tour right now throughout Louisiana. It is his most popular of the three paintings, and he and Pete oftentimes do signings together. This is Pete signing his painting in George's book at the museum for events. So how ironic, after all these years and all the bad blood that happened there, and it's now one of the most popular. So we all know George did another Jazz Fest poster. So how did that happen? Well, Jazz Fest called every year. They still call every year. He says no. Well, for the Millennium poster, they called and asked. He said no. They wanted him to paint Al Hirt, and Al Hirt passed away. And he was a friend of George's. He also collected George's paintings. And George was, you know, obviously really sad about losing his friend, but still had no plans at all to do the poster. And then Mrs. Hirt called him. And that got him. So he did the poster, and again, he picked this one to do in the same style, now for obvious reasons. It's a trilogy of three great jazz musicians out among the oaks. And what of the Blue Dog? Well, in the beginning, where he didn't think the Blue Dog fit, by this time, the Jazz Fest poster had almost made the Blue Dog fit, because the Blue Dog had started to become a symbol of New Orleans for many people. And so it made more and more sense as it went along that it was there. Now, this was done in 2001. If you don't know by now that George is an abstract artist, this is him screaming at you that he's an abstract artist. This is 4 canvases. Each one is 3 feet square. And so they all go together, but not completely together, with a few inches in between. It's called dependence, because every piece is dependent on the others. He did a whole series of really kind of abstract Blue Dog paintings, very, very tight. He worked on this for months. It was fantastic. You have to notice, if you look at this, all these patterns are just as interesting for George as the overall image. Again, he's not seeing a dog. He's really seeing this fascinating design. After he did those pieces, the series of abstracts over a couple of years. Literally, this came out of nowhere, just like it did for you in the screen. I got up one morning, he wasn't in bed, I went into the studio, and one of these was on the easel. And I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "It's a hurricane." Long before Katrina, this was 2002, and he did 70 of them. And he didn't stop until he'd done 70 of them. He describes it as something that he just had to get out of his system. I don't know what that is. Some of them have, do you see there's a tree hidden in this one? Some of them have trees, some of them have eyes, ears, some of them have nothing and are purely abstract. And as he moved away from the hurricane series, it was really cool, by the way, when you exhibit these properly, like on a black wall, and they're all round and they kind of swirl like this. They make for a really fabulous exhibition. But he got that out of his system, sort of, and started blending it with the blue dog. Kind of neat. Again, this is 2 canvases, blending one into the other. This is a series called Bodies, and there are a number of pieces in this series. I won't go into too much detail on it because I only brought one because I'm way too shy to stand up here and go through all of them with you, but this one is pretty safe. This is what he was working on when Hurricane Katrina hit. He had been working on these pieces for 3 years. They're very tight. They're called remastered digital prints. He did original paintings, scanned them into his computer, and then played with the images. They're pretty amazing if you go see them at the New Orleans Gallery. He still is working on bodies. That's something ongoing for him. I told you earlier about this water-based oil paint. That's what allowed him to do this. He hadn't painted the human figure, specifically the female figure, in years, because he said with acrylic paint, it built up too much. It was too rough. All the women looked like football players. But with the water-based oil, he could make it really smooth and delicate and look like a woman again, which was very exciting to him. This was in 2001. He painted this on September 11th. That night, he went to his easel with no plans what to do with it, nothing, just going to his studio like he always does, and this is what he came up with. It went through several stages. At first, he painted the dog blue, but it seemed too happy. He painted the dog black, but it seemed really morbid. So he was going to white it out and think of what to do again, and he whited it out with the gesso. And when he did that, something very interesting happened because these other colors came through. Unfortunately, very hard to see on this screen, but in the original painting, that's what happened. And the dog's eyes are red, not because it's like the loup-garou, but because it's weighted down with a heavy heart, with sadness for what happened. This piece, the next morning I walked in the studio and saw it, and he said, "Do you think we can sell prints of this and do something? We got to do something." And I said, "Let's try." It was our first attempt at this ever. I snapped a little picture with my digital camera. We had a small mailing list at the time. I sent it to our personal list. And within 3 weeks, we'd sold 1,000 prints at $500 and sent a check for $500,000 to the Red Cross in New York. And the thing that astonished us the most and kind of disappointed us the most was that we had limited it. We wished we had not limited it to 1,000 prints. We could have sold a lot more. We could have raised a lot more money for the Red Cross in New York. And so we also got wary of, okay, where does your money go? Is it just going into some big pot somewhere, and then what happens to it? So we learned a lot of lessons that got us thinking and unknowingly prepared us for what was to come a few years later. This is the first piece that George did following Katrina. It was called We Will Rise Again. He did it about 2 months after Katrina because, like everybody, we did not lose our home, but we were displaced, like everyone. And he lost all of his equipment, and he couldn't do any printmaking. And anyway, and you're worried. Everyone on our staff lost their homes. You're worried about every single person that you know and your city. And painting was difficult, obviously, but everybody's desperate to do something. Now, we knew we would not limit the number on this. We would limit it by time rather than number. So there would be this desperate need for everybody to buy. We would also give 10% of these sales to our staff and use that to pay everybody. They had all lost. And the money, I can't tell you, between this piece, I didn't put all of them here, but most of them. We Can Stay Alive, We Need Levy 5. This one, George actually hand-delivered one of each of these to every member of Congress so that they would remember. He made bumper stickers of this. He made buttons of this. This was the most popular local one. Throw me something, FEMA. They went crazy. Everybody got the We Are stories at the beginning. Very popular. And this is called Are you done? Okay.
Hurry up.
This is called, you can take the rest. This is called We Are Marching Again. This was the last one that he did. We ended up raising close to $3 million following Katrina. And the interesting thing was a lot of it went to the Red Cross, a lot of it went to local arts. But also we used a lot of it to help people that we actually knew, and people trusted us to do that. And we really appreciated that. And it was through this that we started doing our foundation, the George Rodrigue Foundation of the Arts, which we tour with quite extensively now for children's schools, and specifically for integrating the arts into schools. We have